we don't wait for we're on recording or? Okay. All right, we'll go. Welcome to the work session for the Historic Review Board for Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025. We need to have roll call, please.
Board Member Edgar?
Here.
Board Member Fulkerson? Here. Vice Chair Green?
Here.
Chair Powell?
Here.
Board Member Lawrence is excused.
For the entire meeting, or, okay, thank you. All right. Let's see, this is just the work session, so there are no. Okay, it's up to you.
There we go. The majority of this work session will spend on the Compatible Change Project, which has been a goal of the Historic Review Board for this biennium goal session, which is to review and potentially redefine the definition of new construction when additions to non-designated resources trigger historic review. Over the past couple months, the board has been working on questions and providing direction to our consultant, Kristen Miner. We had a survey and an open house, and we have a lot of good comments, but Kristen's job tonight is to help continue the clarification and flow chart of decision making. So I may be a little bit of minder on time just to make sure we can get through all the slides. But really, we only have 3 meetings left. So we have April tonight, which is continue clarification back to Kristen. We have the June meeting, the May meeting, which is for the most part, a presentation of what we've heard to date and maybe 1 or 2 small clarifications. And then in June is pretty much the proposal. So the proposal will be kind of a policy document about what you're proposing. Kristen will provide some red lines back to me, but those probably won't go to the City Commission because we don't want to be, the goal is the policy, not necessarily the implementation. But the board will need to be approving the policy approach at the June meeting because that will be, right now we're scheduled for the August City Commission work session to present that to the City Commission. And if they support the board's goals, then they would provide direction to move forward through the legislative process. And we can continue working on refining an HRB policy on new dwelling units if the board wants to move forward on that. But we would kind of go from the policy approach to the actual red lines this fall for the HRB policy if a new one is created for small dwelling units. So I'm going to pass this over to Kristen, and she's going to hold you to your comments and see if we can get some clarification on some of these questions.
Great.
Let's see, is that on? Yes, great. Good evening, board members. Nice to see you on this beautiful day. Let's see, before I start in with my PowerPoint, I did want to just point out the sort of 3 different memos that hopefully you all received. 2 of them are about the Compatible Change Project. There's a, 4 or 5 page memo, and then just a little, kind of measurements sheet, how some possible ways of doing some measurements. And then finally, there is one about windows. Frankly, I'm not at all sure that we're going to have time to get to the Windows part of this, but that's okay. I know that you did receive my PowerPoint, which has some slides at the end just to kind of get you thinking about different conditions, and we can attack that pretty hard if we don't get it to it tonight. Then next time I'll make sure that we're really honing in on that project as well. Okay, so next slide. This is just a quick overview of what you're going to see in the PowerPoint. First, a summary of what I have heard from you already from prior meetings. Then we have to dive into more questions. And finally, so I've divided those up into measurement questions and then other compatible change questions. And then finally, just next steps in process, which Christina kind of went over. And then again, if there is time, the status of the Windows project. Next slide. Now, this slide summarizes the decisions or the direction provided so far. And if you compare this slide to your memo, it's really the same chart that appears on the first page of the memo. And this is just sort of those items A through D, which I have heard from this body fairly clearly that this is good direction, moving forward. So a lot of my questions are building on what I've heard already. So we spent some time looking through ways to really measure, how to measure new construction. And I heard that area and square foot was very important. Also height. There were a few voices for kind of putting those together into volume, but I think after discussion with staff, it's as long as we capture both of those, those two measurements, that would be much easier for the people over the counter to measure. The next item, are you interested in creating an easier path for those small dwelling units? And this body said, absolutely. Let's find a way to make those easier, encourage those. And we'll look a little bit more at that in the next slide. Should freestanding new construction other than small dwelling units be slightly enlarged? And I heard yes. Let's look at that. I'm going to try to stay away from actual numbers tonight. If you have strong feelings, of course, I'd like to hear them, but I don't want to get bogged down because we do have quite a few things I'd like to just lock in terms of a direction. And then finally, the language that's currently now describing new construction uses a term called original structure. And what I heard from you all is that is just too hairy, too complex, not only for property owners, but for the city staff. And so let's go ahead and define what has existed as what was there 1 or 2 years ago. Okay, next slide. So this is just building a little bit on the summary of direction on those new freestanding dwelling units. And what I heard is, yes, this body is very interested in creating a policy document, and that would happen, I believe, this fall, led by Christina. And so I'm listing all of the factors that this body might wish to define. This list also appears in the memo, and that's on page 2 of this memo. I am going to encourage you all to keep in mind when you get to that process of working on a new policy document, that you can regulate new small dwelling units with a relatively light touch. And I would stay away from stylistic considerations, just given that these will be constructed on non-designated properties. And one thing that I did add in, however, after hearing from the McLaughlin Neighborhood Survey and meeting was that there were a number of voices asking for some privacy considerations, and perhaps that just looks like defining, you know, how close windows can be to the property line, things like that. Okay, next slide. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the questions for you tonight on the compatible change project. And so this first set of questions is only focusing on decks and porches. So the first question really has to do with whether the size or amount of deck area or porch area should be allowed under this exemption. And by this exemption, I really am talking about what we're allowing here without HRB review. Remember, there's always an option for people to come in front of this body if what they want to do isn't meeting up with, you know, what you're crafting in terms of this exemption. But so the question is really, should the size and amount of deck area over 30 inches from grade, because that's when a building permit is required, should that area be limited? And so I just laid out some quick ways to answer this question. One is yes, basically that, you know, the area of decks should be limited. And again, let's not get into numbers, but that's just sort of one way to answer this question. And another way is that the size of the deck is not really a concern, but how far above grade should be limited. So in other words, is it 5 feet above grade? Is it 10 feet above grade? So maybe that's a way to kind of limit. Go ahead.
Question, so if a deck goes out over a sloping grade, so where it is next to the house, it's 1 grade, but it's going out over, so it couldn't get up to 5 feet, you might say, out extended it over a sloping ground.
Yes, and that is definitely part of this question. I think there's certainly ways to craft that. So for instance, is it more than X feet of, into this distance from grade? Or does it even matter if it's, far enough away from property lines? So those are sort of two ways to look at that question. But absolutely, all of this stuff, once you ask and answer one question, it does lead to the next one, and that's a perfect example. So I'm going to ask the other question next, and then perhaps we have a little discussion about decks and porches. The other question is, should the location of decks and porches, again, over 30 inches from grade, be a factor? So whether that's allowed at the front of a house or within proximity to lot lines. I will say that just as a consultant, and this was in the memo here, sort of towards the end, my recommendation was that yes, there should be a size limitation. That again, otherwise, if it's larger than a certain size, they could come in front of this body, right? And I also recommend that there be some consideration of location where this, deck area or porch area might be allowed relative to the house or the property lines. But I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Sir.
Just one quick question, and actually, I guess for Christina. Decks over 30 inches are not allowed in the setbacks, correct, without a variance?
Correct. They're not
Yeah.
allowed in the setbacks. So you're
So-
automatically, if you're 20 feet to the rear, you couldn't be there, and then depending on the zone, you're kind of like 5 or 7 feet on the sides.
So, I mean, I think that could be an obvious trigger. If they have to apply for a variance, then
Yeah.
they would have to, come before the HRB as opposed to a staff approval.
Oh, that's a good point. Any other comments? I agree with your recommendation. I mean, yes, I think decks over 30 inches should be limited. And I also think that positioning of those decks and the front yard, backyard, side yard, et cetera, should be evaluated as well.
The picture that you display here, where you can see the front of the house and then the side of the house, but it's on the side, effectively the side street.
Right?
And so the upstairs deck does not, and to me, look out of place because of its placement
Because it's on the side.
on the side.
If it was twice that big,
Twice as big? No, I think that there is a size limitation there where it does not detract.
Right, so a ground level deck versus a second story deck.
Yeah.
Needs to be controlled better.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, that house is across the street from me, and I've seen it for years and years and years, and I've always looked at that, and I said, boy, it fits so well. And it really does fit in and looks great on the house. If it was on the front, not so much.
Yeah, oh,
Even like that.
absolutely.
So, and with that roof line and all that, it really fits in well on a traditional farmhouse like that.
And there's a lot of people who are doing, second story master bedroom, little, not quite Juliet, but like those small ones that I think the same thing. It seems like a reasonable size limitation for second story decks. The ground size deck is interesting because let's say you have a big backyard and you just want to deck the whole backyard. But there's a little bit at the end that's, over because of grade. Is it just that? Like anything under 30 inches is automatically exempt, but would you just count and draw a box around the area in the back of the deck where it falls out of grade and is above 30, and that would be the base level that you do an analysis? If we said decks over 30 inches that are bigger than X square feet, we would just draw the box of only the portions above 30 inches.
That's how I would certainly calculate it, but we can talk about, if anyone has different ideas for that.
This particular house, to me, has this appearance that the backside was added onto it after the fact. And as the upstairs is used for full occupancy, we need to have fire out access where somebody can get out. And the door is perfect.
The other question I have for clarification, I think previously there was talking about including covered porches in the square footage. So if covered porches were in the square footage, that would just be part of the square footage analysis rather than not.
I mean, I think we can talk about covering, whether we're counting, the area that somebody adds onto their house as roof area, in which case you're counting all roof area, whether or not it's enclosed, or if you're counting enclosed floor area.
Okay.
So I'm trying to separate right now, but I think we can add them back in and then look at what we have.
One last thing would be a roof. Should all of a sudden we have a porch and the natural inclination of people would be to extend a roof over some of it, particularly if it's got a lot of activity on it, the porch. So now the roof adds a new context to me that is not simple yes and no.
I guess that, in my mind, I would be in favor of not having the deck, the low deck, and low deck needs a little further discussion because of sloping lots. So you may have a deck that's 12 inches off the ground out to 4.5 feet off the ground, and there will be a lot of those. So, but as far as measuring the 30%, be it 1.5 times a suggestion you made, or gross floor area or footprint, whatever that may be, I would be in favor of not having the deck in that equation. And making the deck a separate entity, because I don't see a low deck as being the mass that is detracting or significant as far as the overall structure. To the point of a covered deck, that's where I think a matrix may be helpful, in that if it meets the proportion for, let's say, footprint or whatever the criteria is, it also meets the proportion of 30% of added roof area. If they want a covered pavilion, then it starts getting bigger. They're going to be giving up some of the addition or whatever if they want the covered roof area. To Board Member Edgar's point, if they want to come and add as another project, that's where the 2-year look back could apply. So 2 years, 3 years down the road, I want to add a cover over my deck. Okay, if it meets the criteria at that point, 2 years has elapsed, then it flies. And that's one benefit, I think, of going back 2 years rather than one, because it could be a strategic
Move.
add if it's only 1 year, so.
Well, we're talking about location too, and I'm sorry, I'm not as privy to my Oregon City deck knowledge as I should be, but are we talking about visibility in terms of its visible encroachment upon existing historic resources? So like, what if the deck blocks some sort of character defining element of a historic? Should that be some sort of consideration?
Can I answer that first?
Go ahead.
That's a really subjective thing to put frontline staff to. So I just don't, we have to provide
Yeah.
and also because McLaughlin is so sloped, we've actually over the years have really had to struggle with what can be seen from the street.
Right.
Is it seen from the street directly in front of the lot and nothing more? Because of the topography, there's lots of
Right.
things. You can look down into people's yards because of topography.
Right.
And so that gets.
I think that's where like a roof though would get by default, like a roof might be something that is obstructing someone's views or somebody's, so it just might be a natural default to answer that question that is subjective, like you said, by maybe tackling some of these other features like a roof down the line, or, size, of course, or, whatever it is. So I just didn't know if that was something that already existed.
Oh, no, and so because it's so subjective, we've always, view corridors are notoriously hard to legally implement.
Okay.
Would you repeat that again?
Just view corridors are really hard to legally implement unless you have, one page of exacting lawyerly description, because
Okay.
you're asking someone over the counter to make
Wow,
a
okay.
decision of is this blocking this from every single potential angle you can think of, and that's
Yeah.
it's really not
Too
a
big a
type
stretch.
1, that's a
Yeah,
type
yes.
2, that's a higher level staff analysis that should be at a public hearing. I think the key piece is, we're at 30%. So, you still could have a 30% rear porch addition where they just were like, we're going to make the biggest rear porch we can get. And that's okay, right? And they still may be able to block it, or they may do the addition. I mean, at some point, these are non-designated resources. So, you know, if we, I think the larger question is, are covered porches part of that 30%, yes or no? And if, you know, if they are part of that 30%, then you are looking at kind of a bulk or massing question. If we exclude it, then they're here plus whatever thing you want to do. So there is kind of value in potentially including that. But I think the second story deck of less than a certain size makes total sense when it's to the side or rear to not, because it's not covered. So maybe there's and uncovered decks larger than X located on the second floor. I mean, worded better, but on the second floor, located on the side or rear, you know, are exempt. So unless you want to do a gigantic, you know, second story, but if you just want to have a small little one, those can be exempt because they're uncovered.
Yeah, maybe there's something that defines where it's attached to the house, you know, and looking at, you know, sort of that level. Okay.
Where it's attached, this photograph, that being a corner lot, you know, we could say sides or back, but if it's a corner lot, it's much more visible. In other words, if you're thinking in terms of it being less visible, to board members Fulkerson's point about, you know, the deck, I guess I'm looking at it as what is just the overall visual impact of this whole project.
Yeah.
How significant we're looking to try to define a threshold of, you might say, a minor project from a major project. So, and the deck is a tough one because, and I see that even a main level deck being problematic for staff because, you know, they may come in with a concept plan and it's a foot, the back door's a foot and a half, 2 steps, 3 steps off a patio. And they'll say, well, it's flat back there. But we all know that flat might not be very flat at all. And it may be, you know, maybe 4.5 feet above grade before, and staff can't really readily make that determination when somebody brings something in. I mean, the burden would have to.
Well, if it needs a building permit, we'll get an elevation. So if it's triggered for a building permit, which would be over 30, so we'll get the building permit package, which will show the footers and we'll show, we'll show the grade and we'll understand the height. So we'll get that in the building permit packet.
Right. So the burden would be that they come in with enough information on their plan that, yes, this is the elevation, or here's a topo, or a profile or something that it is in compliance.
So if in a scenario where there's a deck that is partially under 30 and partially over 30, which actually happens a lot in Oregon City, and that's triggered for building permit, we would see the site plan and the elevation of the topography. They're getting a building permit, and our planning staff would basically look at the math problem based on the definition, do the math, and tell them you're fine, or if you don't want to go to the board, shrink it, you know, 20 square feet.
Yeah.
So I think as long as there's clear direction, that's an easy one about that front staff can do, because we're already at the building permit. Remember, anything under 30, no building permit, we probably aren't reviewing it.
Okay.
Okay, great. Well, I'm hearing that there should be, you know, an allowance for, I mean, in other words, you're not going to say no to a second floor deck. It just has to be fairly limited. And I'm hearing that the location is a concern, especially if it's on the front. So maybe, you know, making that the cutoff is that, you know, unless you come in front of the HRB, you're not automatically getting to put a deck on the front. And then I'm hearing, I guess, you know, a little bit of not sure whether you're ready to say that decks are totally allowed unless they're covered. So I'm hearing, not quite sure about that yet, and that's totally fine. I think we're making progress.
One last thing.
Yes.
If you were to take that flat deck and move it around and put it on top of the, replacing the roof that was over the front of the house. Now if somebody were to come in and propose doing something like that, how would that change the equation of evaluation?
Well, potentially they haven't really changed their numbers at all, right? Because they're taking something off.
They took the roof off and the posts and framing is still
Yeah.
there. I'm just making it into a,
What if,
I think that I can see that being okay in that these are non-contributing houses. We're not talking, we're looking at kind of a historical
I know.
house here. So we might recoil at that notion, but this is not a style thing.
okay, this, because it is a non.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just, in other words, how
Okay.
big a project is that? And that's not a big project. So I mean,
If it were contributing, and we kind of looked through some of this stuff, and it would then have to come before us.
well, that's what your policy document on porches and decks lays out, is that for all of the designated structures in McLaughlin, those have to follow that policy
Right.
document.
Right.
But I just
Okay.
see that there's coattails to all of this, that when we say something is okay here, all of a sudden, it has connotations of being okay in other situations, so we just be careful.
Yeah, and that's the hard part, is that's a pretty nice deck, right? There's always going to be a bad project. I mean, you can't,
Right.
because we're, the 30% threshold is saying, here are non-designated resources that we don't regulate on a day-to-day basis, but we think when large enough changes and additions happen, they will go to the board because we want to make sure that they're not adversely affecting the district significance. So one little small change, I mean, you can look at a change that someone makes on their non-designated house and go, well, I really wouldn't do that. But it, on balance, is not going to adversely affect the district, right? But if someone is trying to build a giant addition onto the back of a house that is 2.5 stories tall and stucco, I'm just thinking of the worst, you know, the stucco's not bad, but like something that's just not a Frankenstein addition, that's way over here. So the 30% was basically saying, we want to make sure that we're not continuing to adverse affect our district, since we already are approving infill. So this is the staff planner comment. No matter what we write and what we adopt, someone's going to work really hard and do something that we all don't like.
Yeah.
And that's
I
just
think
the
it's-
reality.
I think it's what you said, though. I mean, like architecturally, does it make sense?
Yeah.
And sometimes it does make sense to put a porch on the front, and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, and if it is covered, I mean, it would make sense to me to build, especially if it's a new build, to cover a deck in Oregon City, Oregon, where it rains most of the time, you know, otherwise you don't get to use it.
Right.
So, but yeah, architecturally, does it make sense? And evaluating it from that standpoint too, if it comes before the board and.
Yeah, it could be I mean, I'm kind of hearing that there's, you know, covered porches being part of the 30% addition, but then there's this, you know, unease about larger second-story uncovered decks, and that may be its own trigger, like totally, you know, separate. So you could be doing a 25% addition, but then you're doing a larger uncovered porch, uncovered second-story deck, and that may be the thing that triggers. So that's one way to think about it, if you don't want to try to push the two together.
In a small lot world that we seem to be entering into, would all of a sudden the amount of structure to the square footage of the lot, and now if a deck is not contributing to that footprint. Because, but all of a sudden, I've got very little dirt or exposed land or anything around it. It's all structure of some type.
There are coverage limits, right?
We have lot coverage, but not for decks
Not for
under
decks.
30 inches. Those don't count.
Just kind of mentally going over it, I mean, I think where I'm kind of settling in, I think that decks 30 inches or below that are not on a street-facing face are a non-issue. I would think that the uncovered decks would not be factored into the percentage of the ad, but covered decks, if we use a matrix of including roof area, that would capture, you know, might say the overall, so I like that piece in there. And then as far as street-facing decks, maybe just a basic 30 or 40 square feet. Anything bigger than that would trigger HRB review. I mean, something like that might be, I mean, does that have merit?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just trying to think of it, you know, when you were saying that 30 to 40 square feet, it's like, man,
You know, that would be this thing
how
here.
about that? Right,
Yeah, 3 by 10, 4 by 8,
right, something like that, and that seems reasonable enough.
yeah.
So allowing for street-facing decking,
A small street-facing deck,
Just
so if you had a little morning deck off an upper bedroom or something like that.
right?
Because there again, it may not be particularly stylish, but we're not focusing particularly on style here. We're just focusing on the visual impact of what's being added, you know.
Right.
I find that acceptable, particularly for the upper deck, for something like that.
Yeah.
I think this is more about egress.
Yeah, and I agree with the rear deck, as long as it's not covered. If it's covered, it's a different story.
Right.
Right, so,
It seems almost like an addition than a, you know,
could be.
deck.
Yeah.
So,
So I think that if roof area is included in the matrix, then that would pick that up, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and move to those next questions for next slide. So measurement questions for floor versus roof area. So the questions on this slide really are, first off, I think I heard this from maybe one voice at one of our prior meetings. I wanted to check, does the HRB want to limit the additions and alterations under this exemption to single story? Or do you feel like those additions could be potentially as tall as the building is?
Well, I think, I heard in last meetings, it seemed like we were all kind of agreed upon, and tell me if I'm wrong, but we'd agreed upon that height was important, and so we didn't want to go above the height of the original structure. So if that means it's a 2-story, and you want to do a 1.5-inch story addition, that would meet that criteria, right? Or, so you don't want to limit it to 1 story if you could actually do a story and a half in that particular application. I mean, that's what I heard, right? So I don't know.
Yes.
Okay, great, easy.
So you can wordsmith that.
Oh, yeah. And now we're coming down into the weeds about how to measure existing area for the purposes of, you know, allowing some percentage more, right? So this, the little floor area measurement handout tried to lay out different ways that we could potentially measure that existing area. And I think what it's coming down to is, should we be really using a single story type of measuring existing area, which would be either roof area or footprint area? Or should we add in either a full upper story if there is one, or a partial upper story. So, you know, I did lay out that I think there might be some people who feel that it's not fair if we say that we're using a single level type of measurement. Probably not a lot of people, but there are people who have, you know, for instance, this type of structure here, which is sort of a vernacular / Queen Anne. And those are mostly 2 stories high. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so if we said that we're only measuring either roof area or footprint, then those people don't get, you know, kind of credit for having an upper story. And so when they come to put an addition on, they are getting less square footage on their addition than they might if we were measuring using the second level. So I wanted to gauge your opinions about the way that we measure existing floor area.
Question, go ahead.
This one, I'd like to keep it KISS, okay, and that is to measure the foundational footing of the original first floor.
That's kind of where I'm at too. If it was a true 2-story, yeah, I really like footprint myself because I see the potential of, you know, having the gross floor area in your example here at 1775 versus the footprint. If that 2-story house, then if you're granted 30% on the 1775, but they want to do a single level addition, that's a pretty big, that's a 60% increase in footprint. And that's what bothers me. The 1.5 measurement that you suggested is perhaps a good compromise, and maybe the other board members like the aspect of that compromise. I see that as a little bit murky, maybe for staff, in that an applicant could come in with essentially what appears to be kind of a tall single-story house and say, well, this is all living area upstairs, so I'm entitled to this much, and it really isn't. Staff, that makes it difficult to verify if that's the case. Footprint is very easy to
I have a clarifying question. So,
Yes.
okay, so if we're looking at footprint, and let's just say it's a 1.5 or 2-story house. And if we're just looking at the footprint, we can do the 30% math, but it's a 1.5-story rear addition, but the footprint works, and then you have the secondary part, which you can't be any taller. So they kind of work together. To me, that's an easy math. So, you know, with the 1.5, but if we're making sure that's not taller than the house, and you're having the footprint, that's to me a reasonable, because if you're 1-story, you're still not going to be taller than the house, right? So your footprint is still your footprint. Like the height limitation.
True, but I think you're sort of talking about 2 different things. So one of them is just, you know, measuring what's there in order to then do the math to find out what you get, you know, or the maximum that you get. So if somebody has a 2-story house, even if maybe they want to put a 1-story addition on the back, which is fine, but they're going to have less of an addition to put on if we don't count their second story, right?
Got it.
But that's you know, somebody's gonna lose, I guess, in however this gets measured.
Seems like footprint makes it less ambiguous, you
Yeah.
It does, but I do like roof.
Yeah, I like that too.
I mean, I really do, because, and I would say if that's something we want to look at, then I would suggest that all the roof, and not just first story, because you could have a 1.5 story, and half of that would be additional roof that you could get credit for.
The roof side is, I would like to make a statement. I'm in favor of low-income affordable housing. Okay, so I'm looking at how cost of ownership. And let's say, as an example, I want to populate the roof because it's for solar. I want to calculate maybe just how much space do I need on, let's say, to put 4 or 5 panels for up and down on a view side or a south side or something that has high potential. And so roof, if I calculated a foot or 9 or 10 or whatever inches past, eave, so as that we were capable of creating something that will lead to more energy efficient designs of new construction, where we're basically mandating electricity, that we're open to try to figure out how we can help them achieve that goal in a minimal housing. And so I think that I would, even the pitch, so if I had to go up to 1212 on a tiny house, but so as that I can maximize my solar potential, I think this is an area where we need to be able to be accommodating. We have too many things that right now drive up costs and make it so people can't afford to have a roof over their head. And so we have to be careful about how we can minimize doing things that are smarter and less draconian on their implications.
Well, and my feeling is, if you're measuring roof size and of the existing roof location, I mean, you'll benefit, the owner will benefit from potentially having a larger building that they could put up, which, in your example, 532.5 square feet, that's not that huge. I mean, it's a good size building, but I mean, that's a mother-in-law apartment or a mother-in-law house, right? So, if you've got a large enough lot and you've got enough roof already on there, that's a good way to measure that. But if it's just square footage, you might end up with 300 square feet, and that's not going to be much of a ADU, if you will. So that I'm trying to weigh the difference. To me, and it's if we just go square footage, I feel like we're going to kind of limit, especially in this town, we're going to kind of limit how big these ADUs could be, just by the fact that we're utilizing that math. And so
This is for an attachment, not a detached ADU, though.
Sorry?
This is for an attachment, not necessarily detached.
If you're referring like to an attached one, because
Yeah.
I mean, we're basically
Right, yeah,
focusing on attached structures
right.
for that part, but
Yeah.
we will have also the freestanding.
Correct.
part,
And for attached, I'm
Yeah.
saying the same thing. It's just about square footage.
Yeah.
So the roof area versus square footage, that's where I'm confused I get the footprint bit, but like, what are the plus, like the pros and cons of using both? Or are you getting generally the same math, or that's where I'm a little confused on what projects get?
Yeah. So, square footage, if you measure it just roof area, then you're going to include your uncovered porch, or your covered porch, right? And your one-story garage is counted the same as your two-story house, maybe. If you are just measuring enclosed area, then you don't have any of those outside areas, right? So it's just, it's just different ways of measuring it. And I'm not sure either one is necessarily, better. I definitely want folks to consider that there are going to be significantly larger houses than my example. And there's going to be houses that don't have a second story. And so honestly, it's really just, I think, one of the big factors here is just ease of measurement. That's probably the primary factor you should be thinking about.
I think that, in my mind, I think at least those two need to be in the matrix. I think that if we decide that footprint, 30% using the existing footprint, a 30% increase in footprint, or add, but then also it would need to meet the test that the roof area does not increase. So in other words, you're checking the boxes.
Right.
The roof area does not increase 30%. The footprint area does not increase 30%. Then it's a small enough endeavor for staff approval.
Even footprint can get a little sneaky like roofs can. I mean, you could have a grandfathered attached garage with a foundation, to even a Victorian or something like that, that's foundational footprint now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, it just ends up being a case-by-case sort of thing if we don't figure out some way to create a more streamlined, matrix
So
for
knowing
you.
we have 10 minutes left and 2 more questions, I think maybe we can send Kristen back to think through on that this month.
Okay,
I'm ready.
Okay, thank you for your, good comments so far. Next slide. Okay. So this one is really just a little bit more drilling down from the last question, which was if we're using a single story measurement, should the allowed area then should that basically be a roof measurement? Should it be, and again, I heard from this body that we want to make sure people aren't penalized for putting on matching eaves that match the existing conditions on the house. So we'll make sure that happens, whatever the language is. But should the allowed area be a roof area calculation, or should it be an enclosed area calculation? So, I heard several people say on the last slide that maybe roof would work just fine for both calculations. That would be pretty straightforward, pretty easy. What are your thoughts?
Well, I agree with you that it's not fair that we're going to ask for eaves and then penalize them for doing so.
Yeah, right.
So I figure, we do it makes sense if we're going to do that way, then just do the internal.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens then in the scenario if somebody wanted to put add enclosed area, but they want to add, let's say, a covered deck or covered pavilion? That muddies the waters because you may have a 3-sided covered deck with eave all the way around it. And in my mind, if you look at the total roof area, just thinking of what does your eye see when you look at this thing, how much has happened to this thing if you only count the roof area over the footprint. I don't see any point in factoring roof area if you only count the roof over the enclosed area. because then you might as well just use footprint for footprint. The roof piece comes in, eaves and everything.
Right, that's what I
If you're
was-
adding a covered porch, a covered deck, or whatever like that, and it can be either or. You might want just a little bump out on the house and a nice outdoor pavilion, and it still makes it if you're not increasing 30% of your total roof area, eaves and everything. So in my mind, eaves has to stay in, or you might as well not use the roof calculation.
Yeah, that's a fair
Yeah,
point.
is that what you were trying to say? I feel like that was what you were trying to say, is like if we're going to ask them to put eaves on, then we need to give them the total roof calculation. Is that what you were saying?
I don't want to penalize them if we give them roof. If we are asking them to put eaves on, I don't want to penalize them by them doing so, right? And increasing their
Right.
square footage.
Right.
And so.
I think
It
we're
is
all
a
in
little
agreement
bit,
there. And-
But it's like a trade-off. If I want a covered front porch, do I want a bigger addition, or do I want a covered front porch? And you can have both of them, but you just have to come to HRB if it's too big a project, you know? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And to your point, I mean,
In other words, it's a trade-off that they have to decide,
Right.
you know.
Okay, with 5 minutes
So-
left?
So
Yeah,
it seems like
yeah.
yes on that
Yeah.
one?
Okay.
Okay.
That's
Is that
great.
what- is that-
Okay, I've got one more slide, I think, with some questions. Unfortunately, there's 3, but I think a few of these might be relatively easy. First question, should we allow this same exemption to be used for adding on to secondary buildings? So in this image, you're seeing some little garage structure. Can somebody come in and say, oh, I'd like to build 30% more on my garage? Not sure why they'd want to do that, but maybe they would.
My
Just
my
wanted to-
inclination is to say no, but I don't know how the rest of the board,
Use the same rules. In other words,
outbuildings,
use.
outbuildings cannot expand, and so yes.
The 30% rule?
30% of the outbuilding, not the whole.
Correct,
Yeah.
correct. It
Yeah.
would be
Right.
of
I think
that
that's reasonable.
structure.
That's reasonable.
Use
Yeah.
the same criteria on
Yeah.
the outbuilding, because you're still looking at how much you're changing that structure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty straightforward too.
Yeah.
Pretty easy
Okay.
to figure
Yeah.
out.
So I'm hearing a
You know, when-
majority say, sure, go ahead, use the same rules. Okay.
In the cases, what's happening, they're putting up these little sheds, the detached sheds. And if they added something onto the garage in the back, it would be probably more appropriate in the district, so.
They might allow for an ADU to, come into an existing garage if that, which might be positive.
Yeah.
Next question, and we're not going to talk numbers here, but should there be an overall limit to the size of an addition allowed without HRB review? So again, there are some quite large buildings in the district. If they get to do 30% and add on, a really big addition, is that okay? Or do you want to cap the exemption somehow?
It's tricky.
I think, in my mind, a cap. I mean, I was
Yeah.
thinking 600 square feet, that would be 30% of a 2,000 foot.
It also just doesn't seem fair, so,
Well, last time
I
we
think
were
a
at
cap.
450, so we're moving it up.
Yeah, that would be a very large house, but I mean, that does,
But a small house
the small house will be captured by the percentage.
by the percentage.
Yeah, so if you had a 3,000 foot house, they could add, at 30%, they could add 900 square feet. So that's a pretty significant.
That's a significant,
Yeah.
that to me, maybe there's a cap.
That's what she's wondering. And I mean, I was thinking maybe 600 feet, but.
yeah.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
We don't need to debate numbers, but that's great, thank you. And then last question, and this gets back to people who really change their existing roof a lot, which some of you mentioned early on in this project you did not want to see. So should there be either a height limit for altering the existing primary roof, or should we look at a percentage limit to altering that roof? In other words, should we just say that you can add on to your building as long as whatever you're building does not get higher than, you know, the ridge line or the parapet, perhaps, if it's a parapet type building? Or should we allow people to put on some dormers and really look at that as a percentage of the area of the roof overall and limit that? I guess both could be true, I suppose.
Well, I mean, the question is height limitation for altering existing. I mean, I think we've all agreed that we don't want to go over the existing.
Okay.
Didn't we not? Yeah, I think we did. Over the existing height of the original structure.
Right, so
Right.
yes on that one.
Yeah.
And the last slide that you showed last time, which may have been a problematic where they just raised the roof, and
Yeah.
I would say no on that, because that, in my mind, I would say that no change, no increase of the existing height to somehow capture that. The last slide she showed last time
Yeah.
showed where they had just taken a single-story house and raised the roof, which is a big deal.
Yeah, I would have thought the original would have taken care of that, but you're right. If that is still the original, if they just raise it, it's still the original.
I have seen cases where they've they lifted the house up and added a completely new floor
I've
below
done
it.
that.
Right.
Yeah, and so now the roof pitch is identical, but the house has gone up significantly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's
I
more,
would say no change in the
I
existing
think,
roof height. Yeah.
So height, is height even something that?
You made lots of progress, thank you. I'm excited. And please do consider the window information you have, but next time we'll definitely get into that. Thank you.
And feel free,
you.
if you want to digest the window memo, and you can send me any comments you have this month, and I'll forward it on to Kristen. We will be introducing, before we start, our new planner, Melissa Lopez, who will be here, as well as Jude Tadeus, and I will start to work with them this month because they are our frontline planners. So as kind of direction comes into play, I do want to make sure that they don't look at me sideways and go, that's going to be really hard to do. So as we have like a policy approach, we might go over a couple of options, and they will provide really great feedback if something is really easy and doable, or if there's like a fatal flaw or a Pandora's box with an approach.
Okay. Well, welcome, Melissa, and, well, you've already been here, so you're not welcome, but. I know, she tells me all the time.
so Christina did throw you to the wolves immediately.
Okay, so we are going to close the work session at this time, and we'll take a 5-minute break before we go into the next. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.